Welcome to the Wordsmith Forge Christian Fiction Podcast. This is where you meet the Christian fiction authors who write the books you want and ought to read. Every week we interview a different amazing author. I have been so blessed by talking to these men, and I'm sure these podcasts will be a blessing to you too. My name is Mike Baines, and I hope we become friends here on the Wordsmith Forge. I have about 4 goals with this first podcast. I want to introduce you to the podcast. This is it. And I want to share short clips from our next 7 podcasts. And then I want to talk a little bit about the very first Christian fiction author and make a case for the benefit and legitimacy of Christian fiction. I'll answer the question, why do you only have male guests? And lastly, I answer what made me think I should even do this podcast. After all, neither my voice, my stage presence, nor my age would put me in the category of a podcaster. At least I don't think so. I'm not smooth at running this teleprompter. I get stuck reading it instead of being prompted by it. This might take a bit, but I intend to clear all of that up. So, who doesn't like a good book? Curled up on the couch with a paperback and a bowl of popcorn, snuggled under the covers in bed with an ebook, or listening to an audiobook on a road trip or doing housework. Books are a great companion. You read their books, but wouldn't you like to know the story behind the authors? Let's start with James L. Rubart. From this clip, I think you will feel his desire to motivate people to take what God has given them and try to put it into action. If a person fails, that will be better than not ever trying. You just pick yourself up and try again. Don't waste your gift on being inactive. A fun fact to listen for in his episode is how God used his wife to lead him to start writing.
Where this guy goes away and he says to one guy, I'm going to give you 10 grand. Another guy, he gives him 5 grand. Another guy gets $1,000. And he says, take care of that while I'm gone. And the first guy takes the 10 and he turns it into 20. Next guy takes the 5 grand, turns it into 10. The guy with 1,000, he just buries it in the ground. Does nothing with it. And he comes back and he goes, way to go, number 1, way to go, number 2, number 3. What are you doing? Why didn't you could have at least put it in the bank and got some interest off of it? And what I've always found fascinating with that story is there's not a 4th guy. There's not a 4th guy that tried with his 2,500 and failed. And so what that tells me, or my interpretation of that is the only failure is not trying. The only failure is not trying. Let me put it this way. All of us are looking for identity, and all of us are looking for freedom.
Yes.
At our core, our deepest desires, and certainly a young man who is trying to figure that out with all the things coming at him. And I think that, and I taught this for a number of years, for many years, I taught this to authors. I said everyone has a theme of their life, and we need to discover what the theme of our life is. And I took them through this exercise. I told people, if you tell me your 3 favorite movies, I can tell you the theme of your life. And when I do that for myself, the theme I come up with is reflected in my books. Every one of my books has the same thing. And I've done this with authors for years. And again and again and again, the theme doesn't matter what the story is. The same theme recurs because that's who we are at our core. Even if they don't know what the theme of their life is, it comes out in their books.
James's episode will be available next week, March 2nd, 2025. John Galt Robinson reminds people that they can do amazing things, just like Gideon and others who stepped out of who they thought they were and into what God saw they could be. He emphasizes that we must empty ourselves so we can be inspired by God. A fun fact to look for in his episode is how he got his name, John Galt Robinson.
And I literally got out of bed. I went into my office. I pulled out a legal pad and I wrote down about 2 pages worth of notes. I prayed over it. And the next day I started researching. And here I am, 4 published books, 3 more written books, and more to go. It's amazing what God can do. He always picks the least likely candidate, just like David wasn't even considered They left David out in the field when they were looking to anoint a king when Samuel came by. And after going through all of his brothers, they found, they said, well, there's David out in the field. We could try him. And that was who it was. And same with Gideon. And I'm the least likely candidate to write. If it wasn't for God inspiring, I couldn't write a single page. And here we are. So God's amazing. If there's one thing I've learned over life, and what the scriptures show, is when we empty of ourselves so that God can come in and take over, he could do amazing things. You know, David couldn't have beaten Goliath on his own. He could only do it through God. Samson, you name it, Gideon. And it's the same thing with the writing. I really go in there humbly, realizing I don't have any writing talent. Now, I'm learning, doing a lot of things. I'm working with an editor that's teaching me to improve the craft. I think God does expect us to do that and to better ourselves and to train. So I don't want to say no talent, but I couldn't do it without God. So every time I sit down to write, I pray that he would inspire.
John's episode will be available on March 9th. Philip DeLizio from Maryland is a retired school teacher and has a burden for students struggling at school and at home. His books give young people hope that things will work out. When you watch the episode with Philip, listen for his son's remark about Philip's television.
Well, again, I think I have to give the credit to the Lord, because I never even thought being an author just never entered my mind. You know, in the classroom all those years, every teacher would come in and say, okay, I should write a book, you know, because of the goings-ons in the classroom.
Right.
But I think what really propelled me to become an author, or to at least try to become an author and write books, is when I saw my students going through, not just at school, but at home, in their home life, and in school in general, because that's where I saw them most of the time. You know, bullying, peer pressure, fractured relationships with their friends, with their family, loss of a loved one, all these things. Moms and grandmas, they want good, clean books that the kids can read without, you know, all this silly nonsense that people put in books nowadays, which is fine. I'm not knocking that. That's just a whole different genre. But I don't use any of that. Mine's all, you know, mine are faith-based. They're clean, wholesome. There is some sadness. There will be some tears, because life is just not, you know, a happy day every day. But I try to make the books all have happy endings. They are faith-based, meaning that there's a lot of scripture references. The characters often pray.
Philip's episode will be available March 16th. I was really surprised when I contacted this author and he agreed to be on our podcast. That makes us an international entity. Von Ebers is from South Africa. He feels we each should be obedient to God's word and allow him to use the talents he gave us to lead others to gain salvation. He says that people need to not only hear about God, but they need to experience him. In this episode, you will find simple reasons why those of us in the U.S. should appreciate the luxury of living in the U.S.
Going on in the world, all the chaos, there are people that need to hear the gospel. There are people out there that need to experience God and not see God. If I can take your listeners to Job, where he said in the end, after going through all of that, he said, in the beginning I heard of you, but now I see you. And I think that is the key here, is actually to not hear only of God, but to experience God, to see him for who he really is, who he is in your life. Because a lot of times we hear of God the provider, Jehovah Rapha, Jehovah Nisi, and we hear all these words, and sure that it's God the provider, yeah. But the moment you experience that yourself, him providing for you. And for me personally, there's so many things that you as a person that you go through, and you think that might be unique, but that's possibly the only key, that when you put it in a book, those words, those specific words, your talents, God will use to convert someone. And that's what it's all about. It's allowing God as a miner to delve and bring out the gold inside of you, that those characteristics that he placed inside of you, those abilities, those talents, to bring it to the fore and use it to the glory of his name. And I think that's what you have to do. Just go for it. Do it.
Yeah.
And allow God full reign over your book, and you'll see the miracles that God will do through it, just through by being obedient.
Vaughn's episode is scheduled for March 23. Mitchell Carnes expresses how, looking back, it's apparent to him that God's timing was way better than what his own timing would have been. Things that he wanted to happen earlier in life, had they happened then, would have had a detrimental effect on his life. He wouldn't have been able to handle it. His walk with God would not have been as good. Now that some of those things have happened, he has been able to keep things in perspective. Success with his book series, for example. Do you doubt that a pastor's imagination can include a dark storyline? Now check out his podcast episode where he talks about getting the idea for his book, Watergrave.
Well, and I think that's why God has kind of let me wait this long in my life to have a book series that's really taking off, is because I wouldn't have handled that well younger. It would have gotten all in my head. I would have thought it was all about me. Right. And probably done things that I shouldn't have done. And now it's a whole different story when you go through life and you see things.
You can actually step into God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you've been stepping in it, but you don't always know it.
Well, he prepares you for that. And so as a pastor at the time, I was walking through my sanctuary, kind of picking up bulletins that were there from the week before, turned around and saw the baptistry, and in my mind, all of a sudden flashed a pastor dead floating at the top of the water. Wow. So, out of all things to float in my mind. But then they started the process of who would have done that, why would they have done that, and so that's where the story built. But it's the tagline is kind of a young pastor is found dead in the bottom of his baptistry, and Abby Rhodes must investigate in the place she swore never to return, and that's the church.
Mitchell's episode should be available on March 30th. Ohio-born Kristen Mapes lives in Georgia. He starts every morning by talking with the Lord and reading his Bible. If he skips that time of devotion, he knows his day is just not going to run smoothly for him. Finding out that someone has read his books and that reading them led them to trust Jesus is the biggest reward he can receive. In his episode, listen as Kristen tells us about getting people to the door.
I spend every morning, I get up early and read the Bible, and I've done that for many, many years, and just my days aren't really right if I skip. That's how I get grounded each day. And we have a beautiful place here. We overlook some beautiful woods and a creek, and we have a pretty view from our back sunroom, so I spend time out there. But that's about it. We don't do a lot of travel. We love Amelia Island, Florida. We go back and forth there quite a bit.
What floats your boat?
Over the years, I've heard from readers who have been impacted spiritually. That's probably the biggest thing. I mean, I love reading the reviews, people who are, gobbling up the books. That's good fuel for day to day. But every once in a while, I'll get an emotional note from someone who shared the book or who it's impacted, and people might say it's led them back to Christ, or things like that have brought me to tears in the past. It's like, wow, I can't believe this.
Kristen's episode will appear on April 6th. Doug Veeder from North Carolina knows how uncertainty and pain can strengthen our faith, and he uses that in his books. The characters in his stories are flawed, just like I am, you are, we all are. In Doug's episode, we found out that the issues that he went through wind up being displayed in a major way in the life of the main character in his book.
I want people to understand that I've gone through some of this. I know people who have gone through some of this. I don't have all of the answers. I have characters in the stories who will say, I don't know the answers. I wish I did. But that's where faith comes in. You've just got to believe that, God sees 3, 4, 5 steps in front of us. So When he says he can use our pain for our own good, we might go through something that seems difficult. It's a testing, but 3, 4, 5 steps down the line, it may produce something in us or in the world or in the people around us that really has an impact for us, but also to advance the kingdom. If we had it all figured out, we would not need a savior. And I think that's the great thing about a lot of my characters is they're so flawed. They're not perfect people. And so when you get a chance to meet them, you're like, okay, they're not perfect, and yet they find their way. And I think that just speaks, that's for everybody. It was for me, it was for a lot of the people I know, and those are the characters that I resonate with the most and that I like to read the most.
Doug's
when I read
episode will be
people.
available on April 13th. Well, that's our first 7 guests on the Wordsmith Forge. After I finish an interview with a Christian fiction writer, I always feel like I've been in church. Talking to them does my soul good. When you stop and think about it, the very first Christian fiction author was Jesus. His specialty was short stories. He didn't have to worry about a publisher. The disciples took care of all that. So now we know that farmers aren't fictional. They prepare fields and sow seeds. Jesus tells the story of a farmer who sowed his seed. Some seed landed on pathways where the ground was too compacted. Other seeds landed on rocky ground, while other seeds landed on fertile soils. In this case, Jesus used truth, farmers, seeds, soil types, results, to teach us principles, later to be called biblical principles. The fictional part was it could have been any farmer, any seed, and the soil could have been located anywhere. But the soil is you and me. Christian fiction is the same today as it was 2,000 years ago. There are Christian farmers sowing seeds of Christian faith everywhere they can. There are various results with anticipated consequences. Christian fiction writers produce stories that emphasize the consequences in such a way that our faith is strengthened. Our attitudes and expectations become more amenable to the real world because we temporarily immerse ourselves in a fictitious world that upholds Christian values. There should probably be some data somewhere that indicates how many hours of Christian fiction a person really should experience a day to make up for all the detrimental effects of the non-Christian fiction that we absorb every day. What we are exposed to on purpose or only casually does impact our thinking. Now, you may have noticed that all these authors are men. Yeah, that's on purpose. Can females write good Christian fiction? Yeah, of course they can. Can male authors write a romance scene as well as a woman can? You know the answer. Probably not. Most likely he would miss some of the nuances that a woman would include. Whether writing it or living it, most men are not on the same wavelength as women when it comes to romance or anything else for that matter. And you see, that's kind of my point. You see, John Galt Robinson will tell you what kind of footgear Navy SEALs wear for a water mission. He will mention their weapons are in an airtight bag that you can shoot through. In one of my books, I have this young woman driving a transport truck. And not that this little tidbit is important, but would a woman mention a makeshift throttle control attached to the gear shift of the 1974 Diamond Rio Raider? And so the story kind of goes, with that D7 dozer on the transport, Marcy had to get the big Cummins diesel above 2,000 RPMs before slamming it into a higher gear. Now, that kind of puts a male reader right in the driver's seat. Now, I'm really not sure what it does for a woman. But, compare that with this line. With his fingertips, Mitch gently traced along her chin and moved down the side of her throat. In the moonlight, she felt herself melt into his arms. Okay, I just demonstrated why I don't write romance. But who would be most likely to write this, a man or a woman? It could be either. If it was a woman, it is probably a romance novel. If it is a man writing it, Mitch, the character, is probably getting away to do away with the lady. Regardless, I hope I made my point. It may be a while before I interview women Christian fiction authors. Not saying I won't do it, but right now we're looking for a male point of view. Here's what finally prompted me to start this podcast. I was looking for ways to promote my books. I thought maybe if I was a guest on a podcast, that would help. Well, what I found was real discouraging. The podcast I looked at had female hosts with female guests talking about romance. And I didn't see how I would fit in or be comfortable. If I couldn't find a podcast I was comfortable with, it could be other male authors couldn't find one either. Was I going to be forced to start my own podcast? That seemed a bit absurd at first. I did the voiceover for my audiobook, so I had the necessary basic equipment. I knew I was capable, but was podcasting a mountain I wanted to climb? But it was during this search that I read comments on a Christian fiction Facebook page where women were asking for books written from a man's point of view. Women looking for books that had romance as only incidental to the main theme. In other words, not a romance novel. And that was different. Wives were asking for suggestions of books their husbands might connect with. And then here comes the clincher. This struck a chord with me. Mothers were looking for books with strong biblical principles for their sons who lacked male influences. That was me growing up. I grew up with no males to talk to or to be guided by. My father died when I was 5, and my mother never remarried or even associated with men. I yearned to know what men talked about, what they knew, how to be a man. We had no books in our home. When I did learn about the library, I still had no guide to lead me to books that would instill God's principles in me. I was attracted to books about men, though. And so I learned about mountain men, trappers and explorers, people that gutted animals and stretched their hides and lived by themselves up in the mountains. James Bowie, Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, Jim Bridger, and guys like that. Some guy named Thorpe. I wanted to be just like them. So I avoided taking baths. I picked fights with guys. And I talked rather rudely to girls. Well, I was trying so hard to be like a man, and I just had no idea why no one liked me. So it could be that this podcast exists so that a single mom can steer her lonely son towards becoming a strong Christian man, grounded in the Bible and fortified by Christian principles employed by Christian fiction. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Well, I hope you find this podcast informative and that you will enjoy getting to know the authors I present. Please support them by buying their books and leaving reviews of them wherever you purchase them. That's pretty big and important to all authors. I'm extremely interested in what you think of this podcast and any suggestions you might have. Like, Who would you like for me to interview? Please encourage your friends to join the Wordsmith Forge Christian Fiction Podcast. Forward us to them on your mailing list. Also, I hope you will help me keep the lights on here at the Forge by subscribing, liking, and commenting. I have high hopes for the Wordsmith Forge Christian Fiction Podcast. I hope that you do too. Until next time, may God bless you, and may God keep you. This is Mike Davis, out.